Some choices, they change everything. You don't see it coming. You don't plan for it. And yet, before you even realize what's happening, you're standing at the edge of something you can never take back. I never thought it would happen to me. I never thought I'd find myself here, staring at my own reflection, wondering when I stopped recognizing the person looking back at me. But here I am. And if I could go back, if I could undo it all, would I? You know, trust. Trust is supposed to be unshakable. Especially in a family. It's supposed to be the one thing you never have to second guess. But the truth is, trust is fragile. And when it breaks, it doesn't shatter in an instant. No, it cracks, slowly, quietly, so faintly that by the time you realize it's broken, you're already standing in the ruins, wondering how you got there. My younger brother, he came to me with a request. A simple request. At least, that's what I told myself. And maybe in another life, in another moment, I would have said no. Maybe I would have walked away. But I didn't. I agreed. I know what you're thinking. I do. Because I've thought it too. Over and over again. How did I let it happen? How did I let things get that far? But life doesn't always give you clear lines. Sometimes, it's just a blur of emotions and choices, and before you know it, you've crossed into a place you can't come back from. I'm not here to justify anything. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm just here to tell you the truth, the way it happened. The way it felt. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there understands. So tell me, what would you have done? You know, when people think of betrayal, they picture something loud, something violent, something dramatic. But the truth is, real betrayal starts in silence. In the quiet spaces of a life that's lost its warmth. In the nights that feel colder, not because of the weather, but because of the distance between two people who were once everything to each other. That was my life. Married. Settled. Comfortable, at least. That's what I told myself. But comfort isn't the same as happiness. And love doesn't disappear all at once. It fades. Slowly. Like a candle burning low, until one day, you look around, and you're sitting in the dark, wondering when the light went out. My husband, he wasn't a bad man. He wasn't cruel. He didn't cheat, at least, I don't think he did. He was just absent. Even when he was home, he wasn't really there. His mind was always somewhere else, his job, his phone, the next thing he needed to do. And me? I was just another part of the furniture. Something familiar. Something expected. I tried. God, I tried. I told myself it was normal. That all marriages go through rough patches. That love changes over time. That it wasn't his fault or mine. It was just life. But the truth? The truth was, I was lonely. So lonely that it felt like I was disappearing, piece by piece, every single day. And the worst part? He never even noticed. And then, my brother moved in. He's younger than me. By a few years. But in some ways, he's always felt older, wiser, maybe, or just more alive. We weren't particularly close growing up, but we were family. And when he needed a place to stay, I didn't hesitate. Because that's what you do for family, right? He had just gone through a rough breakup. The kind that shakes you. Leaves you raw, unsure of yourself. He didn't talk about it much, but I could see it in his eyes, the weight of it. The sadness he was trying to hide. And in a strange way, I understood him. Because I was carrying my own sadness too. The house was the same. But suddenly, it felt different. He filled the empty spaces. Not just physically, but in a way I hadn't realized I needed. He talked to me. Really talked. Asked me how I was. Looked at me, not through me, not past me, but at me, like I mattered. Like I was seen. At first, it felt nice. Harmless. Like the warmth of the sun on your face after a long, cold winter. I let myself enjoy it. Because why wouldn't I? It wasn't wrong to feel human, was it? To feel alive? But then, something shifted. It was small. Subtle. A glance that lingered too long. A moment of silence that stretched, heavy with something unspoken. A touch light, accidental, but enough to make me aware. A feeling I didn't want to name, but couldn't ignore. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into things. But deep down, I knew. I knew something had started. And once it starts, stopping it isn't as easy as you think. This is where it began. This is where the lines started to blur. And I wish I could say I stopped it before it went too far. But if I did, I wouldn't be telling you this story. It started with a conversation. Just a simple conversation. But isn't that how these things always begin? Not with some grand moment of betrayal, but with something small. Something so ordinary that you don't realize, until much later, that it was the moment everything changed. It was late. Too late. The kind of late where the whole house feels like it's holding its breath, where the air is heavy, and everything feels different. My husband was asleep in our bedroom. The TV was on, but the sound was low, more of a presence than a distraction. I found him sitting in the dim glow of the kitchen, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him. His head was down, his fingers tracing slow circles against the wooden table. He looked tired, worn, not just physically, but in a way that felt deeper, like whatever was weighing on him had been there for a long time. I hesitated in the doorway. I should have just gone to bed. I should have ignored whatever was pulling me toward him. But I didn't. I sat down instead. "You okay?" My voice barely broke the silence. He lifted his head. And when he looked at me, it wasn't the look of a little brother seeking guidance, seeking a sibling's comfort. No, it was something else. Something raw. Something I wasn't ready for. "I need you to do something for me." His voice was quiet, steady, but there was an edge to it, something fragile underneath, like he was afraid of my answer before I even gave one. I frowned. What kind of request starts like that? He exhaled, shaking his head, like he was trying to work up the courage to say the words out loud. And then, finally, he said it. Just once. "I just need you to do something for me. I know it sounds crazy, but I don't have anyone else to ask." I laughed, but it came out forced, uneasy. That's a hell of a way to ask for a favor. "I know." He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Something in his voice. I don't know how to explain it, but it made my stomach tighten. Like I was standing too close to the edge of something I didn't understand yet. I searched his face, trying to figure out what he wasn't saying. Trying to decide if I really wanted to know. "What is it?" I finally asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his glass, took a slow sip, and when he put it down, his hands were shaking just slightly. I don't know. I just need to feel something real again." The words hit me in a way I didn't expect. Maybe because I understood them too well. Maybe because, deep down, I had been feeling the same thing for so long, and I just never said it out loud. But he did. And suddenly, I wasn't looking at my younger brother anymore. I was looking at a man. A man who was hurting. A man who needed something. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just seeing his pain. I was feeling it. This is wrong. But, is it? I mean, we were just talking. That's all. Just two people, sitting in a dimly lit kitchen in the middle of the night, having a conversation. People talk all the time. There was nothing wrong with that, right? Then why did my stomach feel tight? Why was my breath coming slower, deeper, like I was bracing for something I couldn't name? I should have ended it there. I should have laughed it off, told him to go to bed, stood up and walked away. But I didn't. Instead, I just sat there, gripping the edge of the table, trying to ignore the way my skin felt too warm, too aware. Trying to ignore the way his eyes, those familiar eyes I had known all my life, suddenly felt like something new, something dangerous. "I know that sounds weird," he said, running a hand over his face, exhaling like he was trying to shake something off. Forget I said anything. I don't know. Lately, I feel like I don't belong anywhere. Like I could disappear and no one would even notice. I opened my mouth to tell him that wasn't true, that of course he mattered. But the words caught in my throat. Because I understood it too well. That feeling of being invisible. Of existing in a space where you were supposed to be loved, but feeling like a ghost instead. So instead, I just said, "I get it." He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And I think that was the moment. The moment everything started unraveling. I told myself I was just being kind. Just listening. Just being there for him. That's what family does, right? We support each other. We lift each other up when we're feeling low. But then why did it feel like something else? Something heavier. Something that made my pulse quicken, my palms feel damp against the cool surface of the table. Why did it feel like I was standing at the edge of a very steep drop? I could hear my husband snoring down the hall. The sound of it used to be comforting, once upon a time. A reminder that I wasn't alone. But now? Now it just felt like a wall. Like proof of how far apart we'd drifted. I thought about the way he barely looked at me anymore. The way he spoke to me out of habit, not affection. The way his touch, when it came, was routine, expected, hollow. And then I thought about the way my brother had looked at me just now. The way his voice had softened when he said he felt lost. The way, for the first time in so long, I felt like someone actually saw me. Not just as a wife. Not just as a woman doing her duties. But as a person. A person who mattered. You should get some rest, I said finally, standing up, trying to shake off the heaviness pressing against my ribs. You'll feel better in the morning. He nodded, but there was something in his eyes. Something I couldn't name. Something that made my breath hitch in my throat. Yeah, he murmured. Maybe. I turned to leave, forcing myself to move, to walk away before I said something I couldn't take back. But then, hey, he called softly. I stopped. But I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Thanks for listening. I nodded, kept my voice steady. Normal. Casual. Of course. That's what family's for, right? Silence. And then, just as I was about to step out of the room, is it? I didn't answer. I just walked away. But that one question, those two simple words, stayed with me long after I climbed into bed beside my sleeping husband. Long after I closed my eyes and tried to pretend my heart wasn't beating too fast. Long after I told myself, over and over again, that I had done nothing wrong. Nothing at all. I told myself it was nothing. That night in the kitchen? Just a conversation. A moment of weakness between two people who had lost their way. It didn't mean anything. It wasn't dangerous. And yet, things started to change. Not in the obvious ways. No, the changes were small. Barely noticeable. A shift in energy. A moment that stretched just a little too long. A glance that lingered when it should have passed unnoticed. I became hyper-aware of him. The way he moved around the house. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The way his presence seemed to fill every room in a way it never had before. I started to anticipate him. To wonder if he would be in the kitchen when I went to make coffee. To listen for the sound of his voice, his footsteps, his laughter. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't something I was trying to do. It just happened. And then there were the touches. Accidental at first. Completely innocent. Brushing past each other in the hallway. Fingers grazing when passing a plate at dinner. A hand on my lower back as he moved behind me, light as a whisper, but enough to send something warm crawling up my spine. None of it should have mattered. None of it should have meant anything. But it did. Then one night, it changed. I had been reading in the living room, curled up in my usual spot on the couch, trying to lose myself in words that suddenly felt empty. He walked in, fresh out of the shower, his hair still damp, wearing an old t-shirt and sweats that clung just enough to remind me that he wasn't a boy anymore. I should have looked away. But I didn't. He sat down beside me, too close. Not inappropriate, not obvious. Just close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, even with the space between us. You look tired, he murmured after a while, his voice softer than usual. I swallowed. Long day. He nodded, then hesitated. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, can I ask you for something? Something in my stomach twisted. A warning. A line I knew I shouldn't cross. What? My voice came out quieter than I intended. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, slow and deliberate, and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. The touch was featherlight. Barely anything. And yet, it felt like everything. A hug, he said finally. That's all. Just a hug. I should have said no. I should have laughed it off, thrown a pillow at him, made some joke about him being too old for that kind of thing. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded. And before I could rethink it, before I could stop myself, he pulled me into his arms. At first, it felt normal, familiar. But then, something changed. His arms tightened around me, just slightly. His breath fanned against my neck. His fingers pressed into my back, not enough to hurt, but enough to make my pulse spike. And the worst part? I let him. I closed my eyes, and for just a second, just one, I let myself sink into it. Into the warmth of him. Into the feeling of being held, really held, for the first time in what felt like forever. I don't know how long we stayed like that. It could have been seconds. It could have been minutes. All I know is that when I finally pulled away, my hands were shaking. His eyes met mine. There was something in them. Something dark. Something I wasn't ready to face. Sorry, he murmured, his voice rough. It's okay, I cut him off, too quickly. Too desperate to pretend it hadn't meant anything. I gestured vaguely, standing up, needing distance. Needing space to breathe. He nodded, but he didn't move. And neither did the feeling between us. That was the night I stopped lying to myself. That was the night I knew this wasn't nothing. And the worst part? I didn't want it to be. I should have been stronger. I should have stopped it before it went too far. But the thing about moments like these? They don't feel like choices. They feel like gravity. That night, the night everything changed. I had been restless. I couldn't sleep. My husband was beside me, breathing evenly, lost in a world I no longer felt a part of. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled mess of guilt and desire, my body heavy with something I couldn't shake. I should have stayed in bed. I should have closed my eyes and forced myself into sleep. But instead, I got up. I don't even know why I did it. Maybe I was hoping the silence of the house would clear my head. Maybe I just needed air. Or maybe I already knew where I was going before I even took the first step. I found him in the living room, sitting on the couch, one hand gripping the back of his neck like he was trying to hold himself together. He looked up when he heard me, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. But we didn't have to. Can't sleep? He asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I shook my head, stepping forward before I could stop myself. You. He exhaled a dry, humorless laugh. Not even close. I should have turned around. I should have walked away. But instead, I sat down. Too close. Too close to pretend I didn't feel the heat of him. Too close to pretend this was normal, that this was just another conversation between two people who were supposed to know better. For a while, we just sat there. The TV was on, muted, flashing shadows across the room. Outside, the world was quiet, asleep. And inside, it felt like something was coming apart. Then he whispered, I don't know how to stop this. My heart stuttered in my chest. Stop what? He turned to me, his eyes dark, searching. Lying to myself. I opened my mouth, ready to tell him to stop, to say this wasn't right, to tell him we couldn't do this. But the words never came. Because then, he reached for me. It was gentle at first. His fingers brushing mine, barely there, like he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. I should have. God, I should have. But instead, I let him. His hand traveled up, slow, hesitant, fingertips grazing the inside of my wrist, tracing patterns I wasn't supposed to feel. My pulse pounded against his touch, betraying me, exposing everything I had been trying so hard to bury. And then, before I could stop myself, I turned my hand over, pressing my palm to his. It was the smallest thing. Just a touch. But it felt like a surrender. He exhaled, shaky, almost like he was in pain. His thumb brushed over my skin, slow, reverent, like he was memorizing the feel of me. And then he leaned in. His face was so close. Closer than it had ever been before. I could feel his breath on my lips, warm, unsteady. My own breath caught at my throat, my body frozen, trapped in the space between what was right and what I wanted. Tell me to stop, he whispered. And I should have. I should have shoved him away, stood up, walked out of that room, and never looked back. But instead, I closed my eyes. I don't know if he kissed me first or if I leaned into him. I don't know if it was my fault or his. Maybe it was both. All I know is that for a moment, just one reckless, breathless moment, it happened. His lips brushed against mine, soft, barely a whisper of contact, and my entire world tilted. It wasn't deep. It wasn't urgent. It was slow, careful, like he was giving me a chance to stop it. But I didn't. Instead, I let my lips part. Just slightly. Just enough. And that was all it took. The moment lasted only a second. A second too long. Because then, reality came slamming back in. I pulled away first. My chest rising and falling too fast, my hands trembling in my lap. My mind screaming at me, begging me to undo what I had just done. What are we doing? My voice shook. I could barely get the words out. He was staring at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. Regret? Longing? Both. I don't know, he murmured. But I don't want to stop. That was when I felt it, the sharp sting of betrayal. Not just against my husband, but against myself. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. I stood up so fast, the room spun. This can't happen, I said, more to myself than to him. My heart was racing. My skin burned where he had touched me. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just sat there, watching me, his expression unreadable. And maybe that was the worst part. Because for a second, just one single second, I wished he would stop me. But he didn't. I turned and walked away, my breath ragged, my body betraying every ounce of logic screaming in my head. I climbed into bed beside my husband, my hands still shaking, my lips still tingling from a kiss that should have never happened. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for sleep, praying for this to be undone. But I knew. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. The next morning, everything felt different. Not because the world had changed. The sun still rose. The house still stood. My husband still kissed my forehead before leaving for work, just like he always did, without noticing that I flinched at his touch. But inside me, something had shifted. I felt it in the way my heart hammered against my ribs when I stepped into the kitchen and saw him, my brother. He was standing by the coffee maker, back to me, his shoulders tense, his movements stiff. Like he could feel me there before I even said a word. I opened my mouth, but I didn't know what to say. Good morning? That felt too normal. We need to talk? Too dangerous. I'm sorry? But was I? Instead, I just stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, feeling like a stranger in my own home. He didn't look at me when he spoke. I'm heading out for the day. His voice was clipped, distant. Not like last night. Not like before. I swallowed hard. Oh, okay. Where? Just out. He grabbed his keys, barely sparing me a glance before pushing past me, the scent of him, warm skin, faint cologne, something distinctly him, lingering in the air long after the door shut behind him. And just like that, he was gone. No mention of what happened. No secret glances. No acknowledgement that for one reckless moment, we had broken something that couldn't be fixed. And maybe that should have been a relief. But it wasn't. Because the silence between us wasn't just empty. It was heavy. And I carried it with me every second of the day. I thought that maybe, I could push it down. Lock it away in some deep part of me and pretend like it never happened. But the mind doesn't work like that. And neither does the body. Because every time I saw him, a glance across the dinner table, the brush of his arm as we passed each other in the hallway, the way he avoided my eyes, the way he spoke to me like I was just his sister again, like nothing had happened, it made my stomach twist. It made my skin burn. It made me want to scream. And then there was my husband. He started noticing things. Not big things, no, not yet. But small things. The way I seemed distracted. The way I barely touched my food at dinner. The way I jumped when he put his hands on my waist while I was washing the dishes. You okay? He asked one night, his brows furrowing as he studied me. I forced a smile. Yeah, just tired. He nodded, but there was something in his eyes. A flicker of suspicion. Or maybe it was concern. I couldn't tell. And I didn't want to know. Because if I let him look too closely, he might see what was already written all over my face. At night, I laid in bed beside my husband, staring at the ceiling, feeling his body warm beside mine, steady, familiar. But I wasn't thinking about him. I was thinking about the way my brother's lips had brushed against mine, the way his breath had hitched, the way my own body had betrayed me, leaning into him instead of pulling away. I turned onto my side, squeezing my eyes shut, willing the memory away. But guilt is funny like that. It doesn't just disappear. It lingers. It burrows deep. And no matter how much you try to pretend it's not there, you feel it in the quiet moments. In the spaces between words. In the weight of a gaze that lasts a second too long. I had thought that kissing him was the worst thing I could do. But I was wrong. Because now, I wasn't just living with the guilt. I was living with the longing. The days passed, and he started avoiding me. He stayed out later. He answered me with short, clipped responses. He didn't sit next to me at dinner anymore. And the worst part? I hated it. I should have been grateful that he was making it easier. That he was doing what I couldn't, creating space, pretending nothing had happened. But instead, I felt abandoned. Like I had meant something in that moment, and now I didn't. Like I had been the only one feeling the pull, the weight, the need. And that hurt in a way I hadn't expected. Then one night, as I was getting ready for bed, there was a soft knock on my door. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs, because I knew it was him. And when I opened it, when our eyes met in the dim glow of the hallway, I knew something else too. This wasn't over. Not even close. They say guilt is supposed to stop you from doing the wrong thing. That it's a warning. A flashing red light telling you to turn back before it's too late. But what happens when guilt and desire feel like the same thing? Because that's where I was, stuck in this endless loop of shame and longing, torn between the person I was supposed to be and the person I had become. I let it go too far. That was the truth, wasn't it? I let it happen. I didn't stop it. I didn't pull away soon enough. I let the moment stretch, let the silence linger, let the lines blur until there was no denying what was happening. But was it really wrong? Or was it just human? Is it wrong to crave connection? To want to be seen? To feel something real, even for just a second? Because that's what it was. That's what he gave me. For the first time in years, I wasn't just someone's wife, someone's afterthought. I was wanted. I was noticed. And for the briefest moment, I had let myself believe I deserved it. That I wasn't selfish for needing it. That I wasn't a bad person for wanting more than an empty marriage and a love that had faded without me even realizing it. But now, in the heavy silence of my bedroom, with my husband breathing evenly beside me, oblivious to the storm raging inside me, I wasn't so sure. What even is betrayal? Is it the kiss? The touch? The moment two people cross a line that can never be erased? Or does it start long before that? In the stolen glances? The unspoken thoughts? The quiet moments where the heart whispers things the mind refuses to acknowledge? Because if betrayal is about breaking trust, then hadn't I already done that? Hadn't I been unfaithful the moment I wanted something that wasn't mine to want? Even if nothing had really happened? Even if I had pulled away? Even if we had stopped before we completely shattered what little was left of the walls between us? Did it even matter? Because in my heart, I already knew I had crossed a line long before our lips ever touched. I wanted to believe that I was still in control. That I could walk away from this, bury it deep, and pretend it never happened. That it was a lapse in judgment, nothing more. That I wasn't selfish. That I wasn't weak. But the problem with lying to yourself? The truth doesn't disappear. It lingers. It festers. And every time I closed my eyes, I wasn't thinking about my husband. I wasn't thinking about our life together, our shared past, or the vows we had spoken so easily years ago. I was thinking about him. The way his voice had dropped to a whisper. The way his fingers had brushed my skin. The way he had looked at me, like I was something more than just a title, like I was something worth wanting. And if I was honest with myself, If I stripped away all the justifications, all the excuses, all the logic I had built around my choices, I didn't regret it. That was the worst part. That was the thing that made the guilt unbearable. Because I knew I should regret it. I wanted to regret it. But deep down, in the parts of myself I was too afraid to name, I didn't. And that scared me more than anything. I know what some of you are thinking. I know some of you are already shaking your heads, whispering to yourselves, how could she? And maybe you're right to judge me. Maybe I deserve it. Maybe what I did was unforgivable. Maybe there's no excuse for it, no way to justify the choices I made, the lines I crossed, the feelings I let take root when I should have pulled them out before they ever had the chance to grow. Maybe I am the villain in my own story. Or maybe this is just what it means to be human. Because let's be honest, haven't we all felt that pull before? That moment when something forbidden, something dangerous, feels too tempting to ignore? That second where you're standing on the edge of something you know is wrong, but a part of you, maybe the part that's been starved for too long, whispers, just once. Just this moment. Haven't we all wanted to be wanted? To be seen? To feel something real, even if just for a second? I didn't wake up that morning and decide to betray my marriage. I didn't plan for this to happen. I didn't want this to happen. But it did. And now? Now I have to live with it. So tell me, what would you have done? If you were in my place, lonely, unseen, craving something you couldn't even name, would you have had the strength to walk away? Or would you have done exactly what I did? Be honest. Because I need to know. Was this just a mistake? Or was it something deeper? Something inevitable? Drop a comment below. Tell me the truth. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, if you've ever found yourself lost in something you never saw coming, I want to hear your story. Because maybe I'm not the only one. Some moments change you forever. Not in the way movies make it seem, not with some dramatic revelation, not with fireworks or grand gestures. No, real change happens in silence. In stolen moments. In the spaces between what was and what will never be again. And once it happens, once you cross that line, you can never go back. I've tried to convince myself that I was strong enough to forget. That it was just a mistake. That time would erase it, make it feel small, insignificant, just a moment of weakness in a life full of better choices. But some things don't fade. Some moments don't shrink into the past. They settle inside you. Like a shadow. Like a scar. And no matter how much distance you put between yourself and that moment, no matter how much you pretend it never happened, it's still there. Waiting. Lingering in the quiet. A whisper in the back of your mind. I still don't know if I made the right choice that night, or if I was doomed from the start. Maybe it was always leading here. Maybe life is nothing more than a series of almosts and maybes, of paths we take and doors we close too late. Or maybe I just wasn't strong enough to stop it. But one thing I do know, once you've seen someone in a different light, you can never unsee it.